Magandang umaga sa lahat. Ako po si Dionito Cabillas ng Iglesia Filipina Independiente. Naglilingkod po ako sa parokya ng Mabuting Pastol sa Bacood, Santa Mesa, Manila. At naglilingkod din po ako bilang Diocesan Program Coordinator ng Diocese of the Greater Manila Area. Ang IFI vote for dignity is the contribution on the Christian engagement in politics today. Is our task to share with you. Ito ay nakaugat sa witnessing ministry ng IFI. The participation of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente in May 2022 elections is an exercise of our witnessing ministry. Our witnessing ministry is rooted in the number 2 of the introduction of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente Constitution and Canons, which states, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente is a congregation of new persons educated in and liberated by the teaching of Christ, dedicated to the worship of God in spirit and in truth, nourished and sustained in the Eucharist, and commissioned to be witnesses to God's love in the world. As witnesses of God's love, we will facilitate an electoral education campaign. We will vote for the qualified candidates. We will serve as watchers to ensure that a clean, honest, and orderly elections happen. And we demand for accountability on the campaign platforms of the candidates if ever they won. In addition to this task, the lay people of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the youth of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the laymen of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, and the women of the Philippine Independent Church can participate in the electoral campaign to campaign for particular candidates. They are guided on the IFI Articles of Religion number 19, Church and State, stating, this church is politically independent of the state, and the state of the church. The church does not ally itself with any political school of political thought. The church does not ally itself with any particular school of political thought or with any political party. Its members are politically free and are urged to be exemplary citizens and to use this influence for the prosperity and welfare of the state. The vote is sacred. Our vote is the will of the people, and our vote is the voice of God. In the event of the failure of elections because of no credible result due to massive cheating, we should serve as witnesses or join in the people's protest and actions. We will carry one common task of registering our dismay and protest, joined with the people in the filing legal complaints and march on the streets for truth, fairness, and justice. If I vote for dignity is guided with the reading of the signs, the Philippine situation. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the poor public health system in our country. While the government responded the health crisis inadequately, other lingering problems are left not addressed, like one, landlessness and lack of government assistance in agricultural productions, rice importations, and the flooding of smuggled vegetables and other products. Number two, contractualization, unjust wages, and deprivation of workers' rights and benefits. Number three, the urban poor has no permanent employment and always threatened by the government's demolition program. Number four, the overseas Filipino workers are continually exploited by the racial discriminations and employers' abuses and government's neglects. And the labor export policy of the government is one of the root causes of their sufferings. Number five, the indigenous peoples and the Moro people cannot properly and peacefully settle in their own ancestral lands because of the government's anti-terrorist campaign and development aggressions. Number six, the country's natural, mineral, and water resources are continually plundered because of the liberalization of the mining industry and other pro-foreign investment government policies and programs. Number seven, China continues to occupy and exploit the West Philippine Sea because the Duterte government is not willing to defend the country's patrimony and territory. Number eight, the country's international foreign policy depends on the superiority of the United States while embracing China that has invaded the Philippine territory. Number nine, the activists, human rights and peace advocates, and even humanitarian groups have been facing harassment, abuses, and threatened, and worse, they became victims of extrajudicial killings. These problems have divided the Filipino people. The militarized government even exacerbates this crisis. The anti-terror campaign of the government has become the source of money-making among the politicians and the state forces. The economic crisis have exposed the volatile political situation in the country. The rampant acts of corruptions in the government agencies and state forces had worsened the situation. Even political parties and individual politicians are bickering to save and protect their wealth, business interests, and positions in the governments. The disputes among politicians have seemingly led to a political crisis. The if I vote for dignity is our slogan. Our campaign slogan shall be, if I vote for dignity. As a church, we understand that a good leader should be committed to and must stand for the dignity. This stands for defense of human rights and sovereignty, independent foreign policy and protectionist economy, G, good governance and moral leadership, and national industrialization and genuine agrarian reform for just and lasting peace. I, integrity of creation and for justice and peace. T, truth, transparency, and accountability. Y, youth-oriented development and nation building. Defense of human rights and sovereignty. Gumagamit kami ng Psalm 82, 3 and 4. Give justice to the poor and the orphan. Uphold the rights of the oppressed and the destitute. Rescue the poor and helpless. Deliver them from the grasp of evil people. Ang talakayan po namin nito sa mga pag-aaral ay human rights violations, impunity and tyranny. And Philippine Constitution Section 11, state policies guarantees full respect for human rights. Independent foreign policy and protectionist economy. At gamit natin ay Galatians 5 verse 1. From freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm. Therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Ang talakayan natin dito ay West Philippine Sea. And China intrusion in our West Philippine Sea. Globalization. And Article 2, Section 19, Philippine Constitution. The state shall develop a self-reliant and independent national economy effectively controlled by Filipinos. G, governance, good governance, and moral leadership. At gamit natin dito ay James 4 verses 6 to 10. Do not choose a leader that is full of pride. Ang pag-usapan natin dito ay good governance, which has 8 major characteristics as explicitly included in the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, which are consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and follows the rule of law. Talakayan din natin ang government policies that do not consult the people, which result to being inefficient and anti-people. The leaders who become bad examples in public and social media. National industrialization and genuine agrarian reform for just and lasting peace. At ang gamit natin na biblical verse ay Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And James 3 verses 18. Peacemakers who sow the peace reap a harvest of righteousness. At ang talakayan dito ay peace talks, social economic reforms, workers' rights, overseas Filipino workers, the reasons for living for abroad is the worsening Philippine economy. Integrity of creation as national patrimony. Talakayan natin at ginamit dito ay Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the human and put him on the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. At ang talakayan dito ay Development Aggression, Mining Act of 1995, environmental destruction, pagtatayo ng mga dams, at indigenous people's concerns. T, truth, transparency, and accountability. At gamit dito ay John 8:31 to 32. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." At ang talakayan dito ay corruption and impunity. Yung check and balance sa gobyerno. Yung executive, legislative, at judiciary. At talakayan din dito ang political dynasty. Ang last ay youth-oriented development and nation building. At ang biblical verse ay 1 Timothy chapter 4 verses 12 to 16. An example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Points of discussion dito ay youth participation in nation building, social media to young people, children's rights, at yung nationalist, scientific, mass-oriented, pro-people education. Our IFI vote for dignity in May 2022 would be guided with our theological understanding of the mission of Jesus Christ in Luke chapter 4 verses 16 to 21. We will ask the candidates about their commitment of serving God's people and strive to actualize a vision, mission, and ministry of Jesus Christ. Luke 4:16-21 is all about the vision and mission of Jesus Christ. The leaders that are enticed to do this mission must be those who are committed to actualize the message of the verses 18 and 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim the captives, that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. The political leaders who are needed today are those committed to serve the people of God, especially the poor. The problem in dealing the poor Filipino people is always a problem, because some politicians are always thinking of the poor as the object of serving. In fact, candidates will always use the word poor so that people will vote for them. The candidates who pledge to serve the poor must commit to bring good news to the poor. It means that the disparity of social status among the Filipino people should be addressed. What are those good news to the poor? The good news to the poor are their liberation from their dehumanizing situation. 3 years or 6 years of serving the poor is not enough to liberate them, but at least public servants should have the heart for them and help them to free themselves. The committed leaders should always defend the struggle of the poor and not to condemn their efforts to be emancipated from the sinful situation wrought about by poverty and injustices. The committed leaders are willing to do in bringing and proclaiming that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free. Proclaiming is teaching and doing. Are the candidates of elections 2022 can stand and commit to work on the realization of the biblical mandate of proclaiming good news to the poor, and that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free. This should be scrutinized. Studying seriously the qualifications and qualities of the candidates for national and local elections in May 2022 are our great task. We should seriously consider in voting who are servant, God-fearing, trustworthy, good steward, and committed leaders to bring good news to the poor, and the captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free. The IFI has formulated guidelines for the IFI Vote for Dignity. And we have letter A, we will launch voter education campaign. And number one of this is holding vigorous education activities using our prepared biblico-theological reflections, Signs of the Times, which is the national situation, and the ways of cheating, our reading of the fraud in the Philippines, and IFI Vote for Dignity, educational materials produced by the November 8 to 9, 2021 consultation, and ensure the local and national candidates would be scrutinized based on these documents and the pastoral letter of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente. Number 2, maximize existing education committee in the diocese, parish as full of educators. We will encourage all members of the education committee to be part of the pool educators. Number 3, we will mobilize the mandated organizations, the women of the Philippine Independent Church, the laymen of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, and the youth of the Iglesia Filipina Independiente to participate electoral education campaign in every parish, mission, and faith communities. Number 4, the Diocesan Concordat Ecumenical and Interfaith Committee would serve as initiating network to reach out the churches and faith communities that agree to the IFI Vote for Dignity. We will encourage cooperations and coordinations with other churches and faith communities. And number 5, the diocese shall create documentation committee to document or record acts of fraud, election-related violence, and human rights violations. A day before election, we will invite all candidates for a liturgical service to affirm their commitment to the IFI Vote for Dignity. On that day of the election day, we will encourage to go out, vote, and safeguard the sanctity of votes. Number 1, focus and scrutinize track record of candidates and do not rely on surveys. Number 2, the IFI encourages the voters to vote early. Number 3, help ensure that voters would not be disenfranchised. Number 4, expose vote buying and other ways of cheating. Number 5, report anomalous acts and violence related to the elections. Yung voters mismo, sila na ang mag-report, sila nang mag-document at ipasa sa documentation committee. Sa araw na yon, we will serve as poll watchers. Number 1, we will mobilize the voters and educators to volunteer as poll watchers. The IFI poll watching is connected to the Contradaya group. Documented fraud election-related cases would be submitted to the Contradaya, National Contradaya, and the IFI National Monitoring Center. The IFI voters must be ready to participate in the people's protest if the elections are not clean and credible. And last, the IFI demand accountability from politicians to stay true to the promises made during campaign by supporting issues and concerning affecting people's lives. Just living wages, end of contract, agrarian reform, OFW's concern, land-based seafarers, and land-based OFWs. Indigenous peoples and Moro people's rights. These are our concerns, among others. So the IFI vote for dignity is our contribution to the Christian engagement in politics today. Maraming salamat po.